The bruise had already begun to yellow at the edges by the time Penny arrived at the great hall that morning. She kept her sleeve pulled low, the gray wool scratching against the inside of her wrist as she carried the first tray of the day from the kitchen corridor into the receiving room of Stonehaven Keep. The smell of rendered fat and fresh bread followed her like a shadow she could not shake. Familiar, domestic, safe. She had learned to find comfort in familiar things. Familiar things did not surprise her. The keep was not her home. It had never been her home. But for 3 years it had been her place of work, and she had carved out something quiet and steady within its stone walls. A role no one contested, a presence no one noticed. She was the head steward's assistant, responsible for the preparation of the Lord's receiving chambers, the arrangement of morning councils, the management of visiting delegations, and the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept a noble household running without anyone having to ask. She was good at her work. She was precise, efficient, and most importantly, invisible. That invisibility had once felt like armor. Now she understood it had been a cage. She set the tray on the long oak table near the arched window and straightened the cups with practiced fingers. Outside, the sky was the color of old iron, low clouds pressing down on the mountains that ringed the valley, the kind of morning that smelled like rain before the first drop ever fell. The courtyard below was already busy with the movement of horses and cloaked riders. Something was happening. She had noticed the extra guards on the outer gates when she came through the servants' passage, but she had told herself it was not her concern. She told herself that about many things. The door at the far end of the room opened. She did not look up. "You're early." She recognized the voice before she could stop her body from reacting. A tightening through her shoulders, a stillness in her hands that was not calm, but its near cousin. She set the last cup down with quiet precision and turned. Dorian stood in the doorway. He was dressed better than she remembered. New riding coat, dark green with brass buttons, his brown hair combed back the way he used to wear it when he wanted to look like someone of standing. He had that look on his face, the one she used to mistake for confidence. "I heard you were still working here," he said, stepping inside as though the room had been expecting him. Penny kept her expression level. "I work here every morning. Nothing unusual about that." "No." He smiled, and the smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "I suppose not." She turned back to the table and began unfolding the linen napkins. Her hands were steady. She had practiced this, the steadiness, for 8 months, since the morning she had found his letter. Since the morning she had understood, with a cold and total clarity, that the man she had trusted with her brother's name, her family's last holdings, and the small amount of gold her father had left hidden behind a stone in the cellar, had taken all of it. Not borrowed, not misplaced. Taken. And vanished. For 4 months. Until now, apparently. "I came to speak with the steward," Dorian said from somewhere behind her. "Lord Fenwick's council has business with Stonehaven's household accounts." "Then you should wait in the outer hall. The steward receives visitors there. I wanted to see you first." She set the last napkin down and faced him again, because she refused to give him her back as a retreat. "Dorian, whatever you want to say, I have no interest in hearing it. I have work to finish before the council arrives." "You always had work to finish." Something shifted in his expression. Not hurt. Something harder than hurt. "That was always the problem with you, Penny. You were so busy being useful to everyone else that you never asked what was actually happening around you." The words landed strangely, because they were not entirely wrong, and he knew it. That was the particular cruelty of people who had once been close. They knew exactly which truths to weaponize. "What do you want?" she asked. He took another step toward her. The room was large, but somehow it shrank. "I want to explain. What happened with the money? It's more complicated than it looked. Your brother's situation, the holdings. There were debts, Penny. Debts your father didn't tell you about. I was trying to— Stop. She said it quietly, but without any softness. My brother's situation. You used my brother's situation. You told me the gold was for his release from the Northern Ward. You told me the debt holder had agreed to a private arrangement. You told me you had contacts. She paused. And then you disappeared. I had to leave quickly. There were complications. My brother is still in the Northern Ward. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. 8 months later, the same ward, because the gold you took was the only thing I had to give, and it is gone. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, precisely, but the discomfort of a man who had not expected to be confronted this clearly. He reached out and closed his hand around her wrist. The bruise screamed. She did not make a sound, but she went rigid, and her eyes dropped to his grip. His fingers wrapped over exactly the wrong place, over the fading yellow-green mark she had been keeping hidden since 3 days ago, when she had misjudged the corner of the archive shelf in the dark. Or that was what she had told herself. She had not decided yet which explanation she believed. "Let go," she said. "I just need you to listen." I said, "Let go." The room changed. She did not hear a door open. She did not hear footsteps. But she felt the shift in the air, the way you feel a fire when you walk into a room that contains one. Warmth, pressure, presence. Something that did not ask permission to be noticed. Dorian's hand released her wrist. She looked up. He was standing in the interior doorway, the one that connected the receiving room to the private corridor used only by Stonehaven's lord and his personal guard. She had never seen anyone use that door who was not Lord Aldrich himself or one of his household captains. This man was neither. He was tall in the way that fills a doorframe without effort, dressed in dark leather and a fur-lined mantle that carried road dust on the shoulders, as though he had come a long way and had not yet troubled himself to change. His hair was braided back, dark, close to black, and his eyes were the color of deep water in winter, the kind of blue that has no warmth in it, but holds a great deal of depth. There was a long, old scar across his jaw that he wore the way someone wears something earned rather than regretted. He was looking at Dorian, not at Penny, not at the room, at Dorian, with an expression so still and so complete that it communicated more than shouting ever could. Dorian stepped back. The man in the doorway did not move. He simply continued to look at Dorian with that absolute, settled quality, and Dorian, who had always been good at reading a room when his own skin was involved, took another step back, straightened his coat, muttered something about returning to the outer hall, and left through the main door with the careful speed of someone who wanted to appear unhurried. Silence settled. Penny became aware of the pulse in her wrist. She became aware that she was still holding the edge of the oak table. She released it. The man in the doorway finally looked at her. She did not know him. She was certain of that. She had worked in Stonehaven Keep for 3 years, and she knew every face that passed through: guests, guards, council members, traders, visiting lords. She did not know this face. And yet something about the way he looked at her made her feel, uncomfortably and inexplicably, as though he had been watching this room for longer than the last 30 seconds. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was low, unhurried. The kind of voice that did not need volume to carry. Penny straightened. "No." He looked at her wrist. She pulled her sleeve down. "I'm fine. This is a private working chamber. The receiving hall is through the main corridor if you're here for the council." He did not answer immediately. He looked at her with that deep, still quality for a moment longer, not rudely, not intrusively, but with the particular attention of someone who is deciding something. And then he stepped back into the private corridor and was gone. The door closed without a sound. Penny stood in the middle of the room, her heart doing something unreasonable inside her chest, and tried to remember what she had been doing before all of it. The cups. The napkins. The morning council. She picked up the last folded cloth and smoothed it against the table. Outside, the iron sky finally broke open, and the rain began. The council arrived at mid-morning, and with it came a name. Penny heard it first from Greta, the senior kitchen maid, who said it the way people say the names of storms, with a kind of breathless, involuntary reverence that told you everything about the weight the name carried before any explanation followed. "King Aidan of the Northern Reach is here," Greta whispered, pressing close as Penny refilled the water pitchers in the side corridor outside the council chamber. "They say he came with only 4 riders. No herald, no announcement. Just rode through the gates at dawn like he owned the road." Penny kept her eyes on the pitcher. That's not unusual for a king traveling under discretion. "It's unusual for this king." Greta's voice dropped further, though there was no one else in the corridor. "They say he hasn't left the Northern Reach in 2 years, not since the war ended. They say he doesn't come south unless something is already on fire." Penny said nothing. She set the pitcher down, lifted the tray, and turned toward the council chamber door. She knew, before she had finished turning, who she was going to see when she stepped inside. He was seated at the far end of the long table, not at the head, which was reserved for Lord Aldrich of Stonehaven, but 2 seats from it, in a position that was neither dominant nor subordinate, which somehow communicated more authority than either would have. He had changed out of the road-dusty mantle. He wore dark wool now, simply cut, with a single iron clasp at the collar. No crown, no visible mark of rank. He did not need one. His 4 riders were stationed along the far wall, and they had the particular stillness of men who have been in enough dangerous rooms to know how to occupy a corner without appearing to hide in it. Lord Aldrich sat at the head of the table, looking the way he always looked when powerful people arrived without warning, carefully composed and quietly terrified. Penny moved along the wall with practiced silence, setting fresh pitchers at intervals, collecting the emptied cups from the earlier preparation. She had done this 1,000 times. She knew how to be in a room without being in it. But she felt the moment his attention found her. She did not look up. She kept her hand steady on the tray and her gaze on the work. But something at the base of her neck registered it. That stillness turned in her direction. That quiet weight of focus. "The matter of the Eastern Corridor claims," Lord Aldrich was saying, his voice carrying the strained brightness of a man managing a conversation he had not prepared for. "We have documented the boundary disputes going back 4 generations, Your Grace, and Stonehaven's position has always been, I'm not here about the Eastern Corridor." King Aidan's voice cut through the chamber without rising, clean and final, like a door closing. "I'm here about the household accounts." Silence around the table. Penny's hands stilled on the tray. "The accounts," Lord Aldrich repeated carefully. "Specifically, the arrangement your household steward entered into with a debt broker named Dorian Ashfeld, operating under the name of a Lord Fenwick, who does not, as far as my record keepers have established, exist." The silence in the chamber became a different kind of silence. Penny set the tray down on the side table with the utmost care, because her hands had begun to feel very far away from the rest of her. Lord Fenwick. That was the name Dorian had given the steward. That was the account he had used to gain access to the keep that morning. She had heard the steward mention Lord Fenwick twice in the past week. Something about reviewing 3 seasons of household expenditure, something about a formal audit requested by a northern trading consortium. A consortium that did not exist. She understood it all at once, in the way that terrible things sometimes arrive. Not in pieces, but complete. A finished picture dropping into the mind. Dorian had not come here to explain himself to her. He had not come because he felt guilty, or because he wanted to return what he had stolen. He had come because Stonehaven Keep's household accounts contained access to something, land records perhaps, or the sealed documentation of old pack boundary agreements, that someone wanted. And Dorian, who had always been extraordinarily good at finding the door that other people had forgotten to lock, had found a way in. And she had been part of it. Not knowingly, not willingly. But her name was connected to his, even now, in the records of this keep. 3 years ago, when she had first come to work here, she had been vouched for by her uncle's household. And her uncle's household had employed Dorian Ashfeld for 2 seasons before his departure. She was the thread. She did not decide to speak. She was not, by nature or training, a person who interrupted counsels, but she heard her own voice before she had finished deciding whether to use it. The name Lord Fenwick came from a sealed letter delivered to the outer gate 11 days ago, she said. Every head in the chamber turned. She kept her eyes on King Aidan, because he was the only person in the room she felt she could address with honesty and receive something other than managed politics in return. She did not know why she felt that. She filed the feeling away as irrelevant. The letter was written on parchment using the Thornfield seal, but the Thornfield family's seal was retired 14 years ago when the last of that line died. Anyone with access to an old document archive could have reproduced it. The steward received it and logged it in good faith. She paused. Dorian Ashfeld has spent the last 8 months accessing document archives across 3 provinces. I know this because those are the provinces where money went missing from accounts connected to families he'd previously embedded himself with. The silence had a different quality now. Lord Aldrich was staring at her as if he had never seen her before, which, in the way that mattered, he probably hadn't. King Aidan had not looked away from her since she began speaking. His expression had not changed, that settled, watchful stillness. But something in his eyes had sharpened in a way that was not threatening. It was the look of someone who has just heard something accurate. "How do you know his movements over the past 8 months?" he asked. "Because I've been tracking them." She kept her voice level. "He stole from my family. I've been trying to build a record substantial enough to take to a territorial magistrate. I haven't managed it yet, because the magistrate's office in this province requires a co-signing Lord seal on any formal accusation involving financial fraud, and I don't have access to one." A long pause. King Aidan looked at her for a moment that lasted several seconds longer than it needed to. "Bring the record," he said. "Your Grace," Lord Aldrich began. "Your steward has been compromised, Lord Aldrich. Your household documents are at risk. This woman has been building an independent case against the same man for 8 months, and she works 30 feet from where he walked in this morning." He looked back at her. "Bring the record. Everything you have." Penny set her tray down on the side table. "It's in my room," she said. "I'll need a few minutes." He nodded once. She walked out of the council chamber with her back straight, and her heart slamming against her ribs, and the moment she turned the corner into the servants' corridor, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. 8 months of careful, quiet, lonely work. 8 months of letters sent and turned away, of magistrates' offices that looked at her, young, female, unranked, with no pack affiliation and no lord seal, and found her claim insufficient. 8 months of rising before dawn to do her work and spending her evenings cross-referencing financial records by candlelight in a room barely large enough to turn around in, with her brother's name written at the top of every page as a reason to keep going. And now a king she had never met, who had walked into a room she was invisible in and still managed to see her clearly, was asking her to show him what she'd built. She pushed off the wall and went to get it. The record was not impressive to look at. It was a leather satchel, worn soft at the corners, filled with folded letters, copied ledger pages, a hand-drawn map of Dorian's movements marked in red ink, and a list of names. 14 families across 3 provinces, all of whom had lost money or property to arrangements Dorian had brokered under false identities. She carried it back to the council chamber. When she entered, King Aidan was alone. The others had been dismissed or had left. She didn't know which. 2 of his riders stood near the door, Lord Aldrich was nowhere in sight. She set the satchel on the table. He opened it without ceremony and began reading. She stood near the window and watched the rain fall on the courtyard stones below. Somewhere in the keep, she knew, Dorian was still in the building. She could feel it the way you feel cold air coming under a door. "He'll try to leave," she said. "My men are on the gates." He turned a page. "He won't." She nodded once. She looked back at the rain. "Your brother," King Aidan said, without looking up. "His name is in these records. Cale Whitmore. Northern Ward. Ashford Detention House." "Yes." "How long?" 14 months. Her voice held steady through the word. "He was arrested on a debt charge that was forged. Dorian had already taken the money I raised for his release. By the time I understood what had happened, the documentation had passed through 2 more offices, and the original forgery was buried under legitimate paperwork." King Aidan closed the satchel. He looked at her. Outside, the rain pressed harder against the glass, and the fire in the council chamber's hearth cast long shadows across the stone floor between them. "You did all of this alone," he said. Not a question. A statement made in a tone she couldn't quite name. Something that was not quite pity, and not quite admiration, and was perhaps closer to recognition. "I didn't have any other option," Penny said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You do now." She did not trust it. That was the honest truth, and Penny was, above everything else, committed to honesty, particularly the kind that was uncomfortable to admit. She sat in the small chair beside the council chamber's hearth after King Aidan's riders escorted Dorian to the keep's holding room, and she turned the offer over in her mind, the way you turn something sharp over in your hands, looking for the edge before it finds you. You do now. 2 words. Simple, clean, delivered without performance. And yet she had spent 8 months learning the particular cost of trusting words that sounded like rescue. She kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the fire. King Aidan had not left the chamber immediately. He had sent 1 rider to secure the gates, 1 to the holding room with Dorian, and the remaining 2 to retrieve the keep's steward for a separate interview. Then he had sat back down at the council table and begun reading through her documentation again, more slowly this time, with the focused quiet of someone who was genuinely processing rather than performing thoroughness. She had not been dismissed. She had not been invited to stay. She occupied the uncertain middle ground between those 2 things, which she found, oddly, less uncomfortable than she would have expected. At least in uncertain ground she knew how to stand. "The forgery on your brother's debt charge," King Aidan said, not looking up from the papers. "Do you have a copy of the original document?" "A transcribed copy. The original is held in the Ashford Detention House Records Office. I requested it twice. Both times I was told the file was under administrative review." Administrative review. He turned a page. "That phrase means someone is being paid to keep the file buried." That was my conclusion as well. He looked up. Who in Ashford would have the authority to authorize that kind of delay? "The detention warden reports to the province's civil administrator. The civil administrator in Ashford is a man named Reston. He has 3 documented financial arrangements with trading houses that I've linked to Dorian's network. Not directly, but through 2 intermediaries." She paused. "It's in the 2nd section of the record. The pages with the blue ink margin notes." He found the pages. He read them. The fire crackled. Rain continued its low conversation with the window glass. Somewhere deeper in the keep, she could hear the muffled, echoing sound of the steward's voice rising in either outrage or distress. She couldn't tell which, and found she didn't particularly care. "This is substantial," King Aidan said. "It's not enough for a magistrate." "No, for a magistrate you're right, but it's enough for a king." He closed the satchel a second time and looked at her steadily. I have jurisdiction over the Northern Territories, which includes Ashford. I can send a royal order to the detention house within the hour. Your brother can be released by the end of the week, pending a formal review of the original charges, which, given what you've compiled here, will not survive that review." Penny's chest did something complicated. She had prepared herself, carefully and deliberately, not to hope. Hope was expensive. She had learned that the hard way, and she had been a thorough student. But the feeling came anyway, uninvited, pressing up from somewhere below her careful preparations. She kept it off her face. Why? King Aidan looked at her without surprise. He had the quality, she was noticing, of a man who expected direct questions and did not find them impertinent. "Because what has been done to your family is a provable injustice within my territory, and addressing provable injustice is my function." He paused. "And because Dorian Ashfeld has been operating across 3 of my provinces for the better part of a year, and the documentation you've built is the most complete record I've encountered of his methods. I need that record, and I need you to walk my investigators through it." "That's why," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "You could have simply taken the satchel." "I could have." He held her gaze. "I didn't." She nodded slowly. She was not ready to call it trust, but it was something, a small and careful thing, like a first step onto ice you aren't certain will hold. She noted its weight. She noted that she had not yet fallen through. "I'll walk your investigators through it," she said. "When can your brother be reached?" Dorian's interview lasted 2 hours. Penny was not present for it, but one of King Aidan's riders, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Gareth, who seemed to have been assigned as an informal point of contact between her and the king's party, came to find her in the records room where she had been cross-referencing the keep's household logs with the list of documents potentially compromised. "He's given up 4 names, Gareth told her, leaning in the doorway. 2 province administrators, 1 debt house in the eastern lowlands, and a notary in Crestfall. "Reston?" she asked. Gareth's mouth curved slightly. First name out of his mouth. She set her quill down. "He'll recant by morning. Dorian knows how to talk when he's frightened, and how to rebuild walls when the fear passes." "He won't have until morning." Gareth shrugged. "Royal riders move faster than Ashfeld expects. The king has already dispatched 2. She absorbed that. 8 months. She had spent 8 months building toward something she had been increasingly afraid might never arrive. And in the span of a single morning, a morning that had begun with a bruise on her wrist and Dorian's hand where it had no right to be, the machinery she had been unable to move alone had begun to turn. She did not feel relief yet. Relief felt premature. But something had shifted in the weight of the days ahead, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. King Aidan did not leave Stonehaven Keep that evening. The rain had worsened by midday, turning the mountain roads into streams of brown water and loose stone. Lord Aldrich, still wearing the expression of a man who had narrowly survived something he didn't fully understand, offered the king's party lodging with the careful generosity of someone who knows the offer is not truly optional. Penny took her supper in the kitchen, as she always did, seated at the far end of the preparation table with a bowl of barley stew and a piece of rye bread, her notes spread beside her. Greta asked her 17 questions across the course of the meal. She answered 3 of them. She was on her way back to the records room when she found King Aidan in the library corridor. He was standing before one of the tall bookshelves, not reading, exactly. More examining the spines with the distant, unhurried attention of someone whose mind was working somewhere else entirely. A single candle burned in the wall sconce beside him. He wore no mantle now, only the dark wool tunic, and without the road dust and the formal setting of the council chamber. He looked strangely, less like a king, and more like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten used to the weight of it. She almost turned back. Instead, she kept walking, because retreating from a corridor she had every right to walk through felt like a concession she hadn't decided to make. He heard her, of course. She suspected King Aidan was the kind of man who heard everything. He turned, and the candlelight moved across the scar on his jaw. "You're working late." "I usually do." He looked at the rolled papers under her arm. "You should sleep." "I'll sleep when Cale is home." Something moved through his expression, brief, contained. Fair enough. She paused at a distance that felt appropriately professional. She owed him honesty, she decided. He had acted honestly with her, and she respected the currency. "Earlier today," she said. "In the receiving room. How long had you been in that corridor before you came through the door?" He considered the question. "Long enough." "Long enough to see him take hold of my wrist." "Yes." She held his gaze. "I didn't need the intervention." "I know." He said it without apology or argument. But he didn't know that. And the difference in what he expected to happen and what was going to happen, it seemed useful to make that difference visible. She thought about that. It was not the answer she had anticipated, and she was finding, with some discomfort, that she kept not anticipating his answers. "You could have sent one of your riders," she said. "I was already there." A pause. "And I wanted to see for myself what kind of man he was." "And?" "The kind," he said quietly, "who holds on to things that have already said no." The corridor was very still. The candle flame did not move. Penny became aware that she had stopped walking some time ago and had not noticed. She also became aware that standing in a candlelit corridor at this hour having this conversation was not something she had planned, and that the part of her brain responsible for useful self-protection was sending signals she was currently choosing not to prioritize. She straightened. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Miss Whitmore." She walked to the end of the corridor and did not look back. But she was aware, with that same quiet, inconvenient clarity that had been following her all day, that he watched until she turned the corner. She did not know what to do with that. She went to the records room and worked by candlelight until the candle burned low, and she wrote Cale's name at the top of the next page, the way she always did, to remind herself why she was still here. But tonight, for the first time in 8 months, the name felt closer than it had before. The royal order reached Ashford in 3 days. Penny knew, because Gareth came to find her in the records room on the 4th morning, knocked twice on the open door with his broad knuckle, and said, "The detention house confirmed the release. Your brother left Ashford yesterday at midday under royal escort. He should arrive at Stonehaven by tomorrow evening." She was holding a quill. She set it down with great care, because she did not entirely trust her hands. "Thank you," she said. Gareth nodded and left without ceremony, which she appreciated. She did not want witnesses for what happened in the next 30 seconds. The way the careful, controlled architecture of 8 months of held-together composure simply released. Not dramatically. Not with sobs or shaking. Just a long, slow exhale that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, and the sensation of something unknotting in the center of her chest that she had not realized, until it loosened, had been wound that tight. She pressed her fingers flat against the desk and breathed. Cale was coming home. He was 24 years old, and he had spent 14 months in a detention house for a debt he had never owed, and he was coming home. And the man responsible for putting him there was currently held in Stonehaven's lower holding room, awaiting formal transfer to the King's Court in the Northern Reach. She picked the quill back up. She had work to finish. King Aidan's investigators had been working through her documentation since the 2nd day, and they were thorough in the way that only people with genuine authority can afford to be. Not hurried, not performative, but methodical and complete. There were 2 of them. A woman named Soren with ink-stained fingers and the focused manner of someone who had built legal cases the way other people built walls, and an older man named Pell, who said almost nothing but read everything twice, and occasionally wrote single words in the margin of his own notes with an expression of deep, private satisfaction. Penny worked alongside them. It had not been formally requested. Soren had simply arrived at the records room on the second morning, set her own materials on the opposite end of the table, and said, "Walk me through the margin notes in section 3, as though it had already been agreed upon." Which Penny supposed it had been. She walked Soren through every section. She explained the cross-referencing system she had built, the way she had tracked Dorian's false identities through the consistent repetition of certain phrasing in his forged documents, a habit he had no idea he had, and the financial pattern that connected 14 families across 3 provinces into a single, coherent web of extraction. Soren listened without interrupting. At the end of the 3rd day, she said, "This is the work of a trained investigator. I'm a household steward's assistant," Penny said. "You were," Soren said, and went back to her notes. Penny did not examine that sentence too closely. Not yet. On the 5th day, Reston, the civil administrator of Ashford, was brought to Stonehaven under royal summons. He arrived in a carriage that was trying very hard to look dignified and mostly succeeding, and he swept into the keep's receiving hall with the particular energy of a man who believed that offense was the best defense against an accusation he knew was coming. He was red-faced and loud, and he used the word outrageous 4 times in the first 5 minutes, and he directed most of it at Lord Aldrich, who absorbed it with the expression of a man standing in a rainstorm and trying to appear dry. Penny was in the corridor outside the receiving hall, carrying a tray she had no intention of delivering, because she needed to hear this. She heard King Aidan's voice through the door before she reached it. He was not loud. He was never loud. But Reston's voice stopped mid-sentence and did not resume, which told her everything about the quality of whatever had just been said. She pressed close to the wall beside the door. 14 documented financial arrangements linking your office to Ashfeld's network, King Aidan was saying. 2 of those arrangements directly delayed the release of an innocent man from your province's detention facility. I have the original debt documentation recovered from the detention house records office as of 2 days ago. The forgery is apparent to anyone with eyes and a working knowledge of standard provincial debt law. A pause. You have the option to make a full account of your involvement to my investigators today, which will be noted in your sentencing review. Or you can maintain your current position, in which case the review proceeds without your cooperation, and the outcome reflects that. A silence. Then Reston's voice, considerably reduced. I want it noted that I was not the originating party. It will be noted, King Aidan said. Everything will be noted. Sit down. Penny moved away from the door before someone opened it. She carried the tray back to the kitchen, set it on the preparation table, and stood for a moment with her palms against the cool stone edge. 14 months. Reston had known. He had taken money to keep Cale's file buried, and he had known. And he had collected his payment and gone home to his carriage and his red face, and his sense of personal outrage every time anyone suggested he was accountable to something larger than his own convenience. She felt the anger then, clean and cold, like water from a deep well. She had been keeping it at a controlled distance for months, because anger without a direction to move in was just weight to carry. But now it had somewhere to go, and she let herself feel the full shape of it without apology. Cale arrived the following evening. He was thinner than she remembered. His coat was too large for him now, borrowed from one of the royal escort riders, and it made him look young, in a way that pressed against something sore inside her. But he was walking on his own, and his eyes were clear, and when he saw her standing at the keep's main entrance, his face did something that undid her far more efficiently than anything else that had happened in the past 5 days. She crossed the courtyard at speed that was not quite running. He caught her with both arms and held on, and she let him, pressing her face against the shoulder of the oversized coat that smelled like road dust and pine and stranger's wool. And she did not cry, but it was a near thing, and she decided that near things counted. "You're all right," she said, against his shoulder, not a question. "I'm all right," he confirmed, his voice rough. "Penny, how did you—" "Later," she said. "Come inside. It's cold." She introduced Cale to no one that evening. She installed him in the guest room Lord Aldrich had grudgingly provided, brought him food from the kitchen, and sat with him for 2 hours while he ate. And she talked. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough for him to understand what had been done, and who had done it, and what was now happening to those people. He listened with his jaw tight, and his hands wrapped around a cup of warm broth. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You did all of this," he said. "I had help. Recently." "The king's people." "Yes." Another silence. Then, "I want to thank him." "That can be arranged," she said. "Sleep first." She left him with the fire burning low and the extra wool blanket folded at the foot of the bed, and she walked back through the keep's corridors toward the records room with the particular stripped feeling of someone who has been running toward something for a very long time and has just arrived and does not yet know what to do with stillness. King Aidan was in the corridor outside the records room. He was not waiting, precisely. He was standing beside the window at the corridor's end, looking out at the dark courtyard below where the lanterns made small amber pools on the wet stones. She had the sense that he had been there for some time and had not needed a reason beyond the night air and the quiet. He turned when he heard her. "Your brother arrived safely," he said. "Yes." She stopped a few feet from him. "Thank you. I know I've said it before. I want to say it again with more precision. Thank you for the order, for the speed, for not making me justify it a 4th time to a magistrate who had already decided I was insufficient." Something shifted in his expression at that last word. "You were never insufficient," he said. "The system was designed to make you feel that way. There's a difference." She looked at him. The corridor lantern was behind him, and his face was half in shadow, and she was aware, with the tiredness of 5 days of concentrated work and the relief of Cale's arms around her shoulders, that her usual defenses were operating at reduced capacity. "You've been here 5 days," she said. "You came for the accounts. The accounts are settled." "Not entirely," he said. "The case against Ashfeld and Reston has to be formally prepared for the royal court. Soren needs another 4 days at minimum." He paused. "And there is the matter of the other 13 families whose losses are documented in your record. The case isn't complete until they're addressed." She studied his face. "That could have been handled by correspondence." "It could have been. You didn't have to stay." He held her gaze steadily. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't have to." The lantern flame moved. Rain tapped at the corridor window, softer now than it had been. The storm settling into something lighter, something that was no longer trying to prove a point. Penny stood in the middle of that corridor and understood, with the same clarity that had always been both her gift and her difficulty, exactly what she was being told. Not pushed, not demanded. Simply said, plainly and without disguise, by a man who apparently communicated the same way whether he was addressing a court or a corridor at night. It was not a declaration. It was an acknowledgement. The difference mattered. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. "Good night, Penny." It was the first time he had used her name. Just her name, without the formal title, and it landed differently than she was prepared for. She went into the records room and stood very still for a moment in the dark, before she lit the candle. Then she sat down, opened her notes, and tried to concentrate on the work. She managed it, eventually, but it took longer than usual. The formal hearing was held on the 9th day. Lord Aldrich's great hall had been arranged for the occasion. The long tables pushed to the walls. The council chairs arranged in a half-circle facing the raised platform where King Aidan sat, not on a throne, but on a plain oak chair, which somehow communicated more authority than carved stone ever could. Soren stood to his left, with the completed documentation bound in dark leather. Pell stood to her left with a second copy. The keep's household staff, the provincial record keepers summoned from the nearest township, and 3 representatives from the territorial magistrate's office, the same office that had turned Penny away twice, filled the chairs arranged along the walls. Penny sat in the second row with Cale beside her. He had slept for 14 hours and eaten enough for 2 mornings, and the color had begun to return to his face. He was still thinner than she remembered, still wearing borrowed clothes, but he sat straight in the chair and his eyes were clear and present, and every time she glanced at him she felt the same small, steady shock of relief. He was here. He was real. The worst of it was over. Dorian was brought in by 2 of the king's riders. He had spent 5 days in the holding room reconsidering his position, and it showed. The new riding coat was creased beyond recovery, and the careful composure he had walked in with, that studied performance of a man who expected to talk his way through any room, had worn down to something considerably less polished. He did not look at Penny. She noted this with detached interest. Reston came separately, accompanied by his own attendant, still attempting dignity through sheer force of practiced habit. King Aidan let them settle. Then Soren began to read. The document was thorough and precise, and it went on for some time. It named every false identity Dorian had used across 3 provinces, every forged document, every false debt arrangement, every family defrauded, every provincial official who had accepted payment to look away. It named Reston 17 times. It named the notary in Crestfall, the debt house in the eastern lowlands, the 2 administrators who had answered to Reston's arrangement. It named Cale Whitmore, and the nature of his wrongful detention, and the period of that detention, and the documented forgery that had caused it. Cale's hand found her wrist under the edge of the table. Not the bruised one, she noted faintly, that the bruise had faded almost entirely in the past 9 days. He held on without speaking, and she turned her hand over and held back. When Soren finished, King Aidan spoke. His voice carried through the hall without effort, the way it always did, and what he said was not theatrical. It was not designed for effect. It was simply the accounting of consequences delivered by someone who considered the delivery of consequences to be a responsibility rather than a performance. Dorian Ashfeld was to be transferred to the Northern Reach under royal custody, there to face formal charges of fraud, forgery, and deliberate financial predation across 3 provinces. His assets, what remained of them, scattered across the accounts he had been unable to dissolve in time, were to be seized and redistributed to the 14 affected families through the royal restitution process, a process overseen by Soren's office that Penny had not previously known existed, and felt a deep, private satisfaction to learn about now. Reston was removed from his administrative position, effective immediately, and would face a separate review on charges of collusion and obstruction. His deputy, a younger man who had apparently been trying to flag the irregularities in Cale's file for 6 months without anyone listening to him, was appointed interim administrator, pending a full review of the province's records. The notary, the debt house, the 2 administrators, each named, each assigned a consequence proportionate to their role. And then King Aidan said, without raising his voice or altering his expression in any perceptible way, "The documentation on which this entire proceeding rests was compiled independently over the course of 8 months by Penny Whitmore, at that time a household steward's assistant at Stonehaven Keep, acting without institutional support, without legal standing, and without the cooperation of any of the offices she approached. She built a complete and accurate record of a sophisticated fraud network, using access to nothing more than public documents, careful observation, and considerable personal determination. The Royal Investigative Office formally recognizes that record as the foundation of this case." He paused. "It should not have taken a king's arrival to make that record matter. That failure belongs to the system that made her invisible, not to her." The hall was very quiet. Penny looked at her hands. She had not expected to be named. She had not expected the hearing to acknowledge her at all, beyond her role as a useful source of documentation. She was not prepared for the sensation of being seen. Genuinely, publicly, unmistakably seen. In a room full of people who had either overlooked her for years or never noticed her at all. Kale's grip on her hand tightened. She did not trust herself to speak, so she said nothing. The proceedings concluded by early afternoon. Dorian was taken from the hall without drama and without eye contact with anyone in the room. Reston left with considerably less personal outrage than he had arrived with. The provincial record keepers gathered their copies of the documentation and departed with the specific, purposeful energy of people who have just been given a great deal of important work to do. The hall emptied gradually, the way rooms do after significant events, slowly, with the particular awkward dispersal of people who have witnessed something and are still deciding what to make of it. Penny remained in her chair until it was almost empty. Then she stood, straightened her skirt, and walked to the tall window at the hall's side wall, where the afternoon light came through in long, pale columns, and the courtyard beyond was already returning to its ordinary rhythm. She heard King Aidan's footsteps before he reached her. She recognized them now, measured, unhurried, a weight to them that was not heavy, but was always present. He stopped beside her. They looked out at the courtyard together for a moment without speaking. It was not an uncomfortable silence. She had noticed that silences with him tended not to be. "Soren has offered your brother a position," he said, "in the investigative office. His experience with the detention system's internal documentation would be useful. The offer is without obligation and will remain open." Penny absorbed this. "You didn't tell me before the hearing. I didn't want it to affect your presence in the room." A pause. He should hear it as something offered to him, not as part of a transaction involving you. She looked at him. That was considerate. "It was accurate," he said simply. She turned back to the window. Below, 2 of his riders were preparing horses in the courtyard. She had known, in the back of her mind, that the hearing's conclusion would be the natural ending point of his stay at Stonehaven. The accounts were settled. The case was formally documented and transferred. His presence here no longer had an official purpose. "When do you leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. Weather permitting." He glanced at the sky beyond the glass. Clear now, washed clean by 9 days of rain. The mountains sharp and white-edged against the blue. "It will permit." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, working through something she had been working through for several days, with the same careful, honest attention she gave everything she was uncertain about. "I owe you more than I can repay," she said. "I want to be honest about that, without making it a burden between us." "It isn't a burden. I know you'd say that. I say it because it's true." He turned slightly toward her. "What you built, the record, the case, that was the work. I provided jurisdiction. You provided everything that jurisdiction needed to mean something. That's not a debt. That's a collaboration." She looked at him. "You're very precise with words for someone who uses so few of them. I've found that precision prevents most of the problems that come from using too many. Despite everything, despite the weight of the past 9 days and the lingering tiredness and the complicated tangle of things she had not yet finished sorting through, she felt the corner of her mouth move. He noticed. She saw him notice, and she saw the quiet response of it in his expression. Something that was not a smile, precisely, but was the thing that exists just before one, held there with the same containment he applied to everything. "There's a position in the Royal Administrative Office," he said. "Northern Reach. It would involve coordinating between the investigative division and the provincial record systems, specifically the reform of the documentation processes that allowed Ashfeld's methods to go undetected for as long as they did." He held her gaze. "Soren recommended you before the hearing concluded. I agreed with her assessment before she finished the sentence." Penny stilled. "That's not a small offer," she said carefully. "No, The northern reach is a long way from Stonehaven. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. He returned her gaze with the steady, unhurried patience that she had come to understand was not performance. It was simply how he was, in the same way that the mountains beyond the window were simply what they were. Present, constant, not asking to be anything other than exactly themselves. She had spent 8 months learning what it cost to trust the wrong person. She had also spent 8 months learning, slowly and without meaning to, what it looked like when trust was actually warranted. She had learned it in the difference between the way Dorian had held her wrist and the way King Aidan had simply stood in a doorway and let his presence be enough. She had learned it in documents reviewed without condescension, in a brother released without being used as leverage, in a name spoken plainly in a public hall by someone who had no obligation to speak it. She was not reckless. She had never been reckless. But she was honest. "I'll need a week," she said, "to settle things here properly. My notice to Lord Aldrich, Cale's decision about Soren's offer. That's his to make, not mine. A few arrangements." King Aidan nodded once. "A week is reasonable. And I want it understood," she continued, "that I'm accepting a professional position, not a charity, not a gesture. Understood. Soren will send the formal terms of appointment in writing before you leave." Good. She turned back to the window. The courtyard below was ordinary and calm. The afternoon light lay clean and even across the stones. "One more thing," she said. "Yes." "In the corridor, 9 days ago, you said you wanted to see what kind of man he was." She paused. "What kind of man were you looking for?" A silence. Then, "The kind worth the trouble of removing." She considered that. And if he hadn't been, then he would have been a different problem. His voice was quiet. "But he held your wrist, and you said no, and he didn't let go. That was sufficient." Penny stood at the window with the afternoon light falling across her hands and thought about 8 months of invisible work, and a brother's name at the top of every page, and a door opening in a room where she had been unseen for years, and a man who had walked through it not because he was looking for her specifically, but who had nevertheless looked at her and understood, immediately and without explanation, what he was seeing. She thought about the difference between being found and being chosen. She thought it was possible, if you were paying attention, to tell the difference. Cale accepted Soren's offer 2 days later, after reading the terms 3 times and asking Penny what she thought once, listening to her answer, and then making the decision himself, which was exactly how he had always made decisions, and exactly how she had hoped he would. He would travel north with the King's party and begin his appointment in the investigative office the following month. He was 24 years old, and he was thin, and he still sometimes went quiet in a way that told her the 14 months had left marks she could not reach. But he was present, and he was purposeful, and he shook King Aidan's hand with steady eyes and said thank you in the way that meant it. Penny submitted her formal notice to Lord Aldrich, who accepted it with the slightly dazed expression he had been wearing since the 9th day, and shook her hand twice by accident. She packed 1 trunk. She had never accumulated much, which she had once considered a limitation, and was beginning to reframe as a form of freedom, the ability to carry everything you need without being burdened by what you don't. On the morning of the 7th day, she came down to the courtyard at first light. King Aidan was already there, beside his horse, speaking quietly with Gareth. He saw her cross the courtyard and said something brief to Gareth, who nodded and moved away with the discretion of someone who had clearly been doing this long enough to recognize when discretion was called for. Penny set her trunk with the luggage and came to stand beside him. The morning was cold and clear. The mountains were very close in that particular way they only are in early light, every ridge visible, the snow on the highest peaks catching the first pale color of the rising sun. The air smelled of pine and cold stone and the horses and the wood smoke from the keep's chimneys, and it was, she thought, a very good kind of morning to begin something. "Ready?" he asked. She looked at the mountains. She thought about the records room she was leaving, and the corridor where she had worked by candlelight for 3 years, and the 8 months of careful, solitary, necessary work that had brought her to this courtyard on this morning. She thought about what came next. "Yes," she said. They rode north as the sun came fully over the mountains, and the road ahead was long and clear, and Penny Whitmore rode it as herself. Not invisible, not insufficient, not defined by what had been taken from her, but as the woman who had built the case that a king had needed, who had brought her brother home, who had looked at an offer made honestly and accepted it on her own terms. The mountains opened around them as they rode, vast and indifferent and beautiful, and the morning light came down across the road without asking permission from anyone. It was, she decided, exactly enough. The formal charges against Dorian Ashfeld were upheld in the Royal Court of the Northern Reach 3 months later. He was sentenced to 7 years of supervised labor in the Provincial Records Reform Program, a sentence widely considered to have a particular poetic justice, given the nature of his crimes. He never attempted to contact Penny Whitmore again. Reston was stripped of all administrative appointments and barred from provincial service permanently. His deputy, the young man who had been trying to flag Cale's file for 6 months, was formally appointed administrator 6 weeks after the hearing and proved, by all accounts, to be considerably better at the job. Cale Whitmore remained with Soren's investigative office. He was promoted within his first year. He was, Penny thought, exactly where he was supposed to be. And Penny herself, the woman who had been invisible for 3 years and had turned that invisibility into the most comprehensive fraud investigation the Northern Reach had seen in a generation, took her position in the Royal Administrative Office and rebuilt, document by document, the systems that had once failed her. She was not invisible anymore. King Aidan made sure of that. Not loudly, and not in ways that took anything from her. Simply by continuing to do what he had done from the beginning, seeing her clearly, and making certain the room knew it too. It was, she had decided, the most trustworthy thing a person could do.